who they fell in love with was not a monster. Who they fell in love with was somebody very different.
Welcome to the global phenomenon, Surviving the Survivor, where we're all just trying to survive in a rough world.
What's up, SCS Nation, and welcome to another episode of Surviving the Survivor, where we bring you the best guests in true crime. And for the first time ever, we have a single guest, and that's because she can carry the show, and we'll tell you who she is in just one moment. But first, we just want to remind everyone that our thoughts are with Ana Walshe and her 3 young children. The search for the missing Cohasset, Massachusetts mother of 3 has now entered its 9th day. She has not been seen since the early hours of New Year's Day and officially reported missing on January 4th. Now, the reason we have one guest today is because she's one of the leading experts in the world on domestic violence. She is an attorney, Anne Munch, and so thanks so much for being here. Let me tell the audience quickly who you are. As I said, she is an expert in the field of sexual assault and domestic violence. Her legal career has been spent both in the courtroom and in the classroom, and lends her expertise to the U.S. Department of Justice and has provided education and assistance numerous times to the U.S. Senate on issues related to sexual assault. And she also trains members of the United States military with its sexual assault prevention and response programs. And she now has her own consulting firm. Quick programming note, please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. On Twitter, we're at Podcast STS. You can also support us at Patreon or get a YouTube membership. And as my 8-year-old daughter says, please subscribe and hit that like button because it gets the algorithm chugging. So, Anne, thanks so much. Got a couple of technical issues, but we are rolling now. And I just want to start off with a little bit of breaking news on Surviving the Survivor. As a veteran news guy myself, I still keep some sources out there. This comes from a very reliable source who's getting their information from multiple sources and law enforcement about Ana and Brian Walshe. It is not confirmed, but I will reveal it. Number one, Ana Walshe, according to the sources, had a boyfriend in Washington, D.C. I think we should continue to use present tense, so probably has a boyfriend in D.C. Brian does, in fact, have a life insurance policy on her, according to the sources. The amount of that life insurance policy, we do not know. And most disturbing of this is that, according to the sources, he has allegedly abused Brian, that is, at least one of their 3 children, who are ages 2, 4, and 6. So, Anne, just hearing this, what jumps out at you?
I think probably the thing that jumps out at me the most is in combination with something that she said in or around that Brian had made promises to change how he is in the family, and then hearing the possibility that there is child abuse in the home as well. That it just is lining along some of the kind of classic dynamics of sexual assault, or of domestic violence cases. And, a lot of those times the dynamics are a bit hidden within a family, and they don't always exist. I don't know, of course, what has happened in their homes. That was of particular interest to me as well. Also, if indeed she has a boyfriend, in another place, and if perhaps he might have learned about that, any of those kinds of irritants or aggravating factors, things that challenge the power and control if indeed this is that kind of domestic violence relationship, that's a pretty big factor, or it can be as well.
And so there is other news here that is coming out. Court records are now revealing, as well as conversations with family, and the local TV stations in Boston, as well as the Boston Globe, has been doing great work. um, points to a history of money problems and estrangement. Brian Walshe, we're finding out, was an only child, but he had a fractured relationship with his father after disappearing with a large sum of his money. This, again, according to court documents. And then following his father's death in 2018, there was a bitter legal battle over who was entitled to inherit the estate. Is this something that you see often in domestic violence where a spouse, particularly the husband, starts to feel mounting financial pressure, and that's one of the triggering factors?
It certainly can be one of the triggering factors. There are a lot of things that we kind of look at that help us understand and put the pieces together a little bit in terms of understanding the dynamics of domestic violence around power and control, of course. And one of them is finances. One of the things that typically offenders like to control are the finances in the family, and kind of use that as a method sometimes of control. And pressures can, of course, mount in any relationship and cause stress in any relationship. And financial pressure is, I think, probably a really common one just for human beings. But if you're talking about things in domestic violence kinds of relationships, that can be a pretty significant one indeed.
So Channel 10, which is now the ABC affiliate in Boston, I interned there in college. It used to be WBZ. Now it's different. They spoke to I think a former business partner, a former friend of Brian Walshe. And this person is quoted as saying, "I even went on a trip to China with Brian and Tom and my partner at the time. I witnessed firsthand what Brian was capable of. I saw Brian attempt to smuggle out antiquities from China. When Brian was confronted, he picked up a stanchion and literally attempted to kill 4 or 5 guards that had come to talk to him about his crime." What does this tell you about a potentially volatile temper here?
That is significant information, of course, for anybody that is trying to understand or trying to investigate a case and trying to understand a particular person. I mean, if I like the whole country, am really, really hoping that Ana Walshe is alive and that she is well somewhere. And when there are indications of violence or of kind of the things that have been lining up in the news media. One of the things that was absent until perhaps today, and what you're talking about is has there been, have other people known him to be violent, and in what settings? Because that is something that would be of a lot of interest to investigators and prosecutors, kind of wanting to know what those circumstances were and whether or not that might be even admissible in a case against him. But it also just tells you a little bit about his temper, and it tells you about the fact that when he was in public with other people, and there were allegedly 5 guards, and he felt it okay to maybe take after them. That says a lot about how maybe he goes from 0 to 60, pretty quickly when he's challenged or something doesn't go his way. It's hard to say. I mean, this is all, of course, speculative. But again, it's not inconsistent with what we know about the violence dynamics either.
And I just want to underscore that Brian Walshe is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Right now, the evidence that is mounting doesn't look very favorable as far as it relates to Brian Walshe, but time will tell. Obviously, aside from Ana Walshe, who's a Serbian immigrant, I believe came here around college time, besides her are her 3 children, 2, 4, and 6. We did find out on the last show that the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families is in custody, but then someone wrote to me, which I didn't know, and said just because they're in custody doesn't mean that the children weren't necessarily given to a family member. That is possible, Anne?
Yeah, that's absolutely possible. It would be not uncommon to just put the children in protective custody for a while all that is either being sorted out or, while they're awaiting to see whether or not mom comes back. So now that's not unusual at all for them to be basically protected while the police are investigating and while they're working so diligently to try to find the mom.
So a little more from NBC 10, which gives you a peek into who he is. And the Boston Globe also did some reporting on this, and we'll break it down. A former friend or a work colleague, I'm not sure which, said that Brian is not only a sociopath, but also a very angry and physically violent person. That is a quote. Another friend told NBC 10 that he'd known Brian since he was a child and described him as a horrible con artist. That is a quote too, but said he never saw any hint of losing his temper or violent behavior. This person says, I'm hoping by some miracle there's going to be some crazy scheme he had cooked up for monetary gain that all this adds up to, and it's not what the indicators are. It's all very shocking. He was currently under house arrest for federal fraud charges, trying to basically pawn off fake Andy Warhol paintings. That doesn't make you a killer, but what does it say in terms of speaking to the type of person that you are?
I know he's got a conviction for that fraud episode, which is why sounds like he's on active probation. And so the easiest way to say it, I think, is that people often have kind of a side of their personalities that they show everybody, right? When we're out in public, we often put on a particular part of ourselves, and that is often friendly, maybe charming. It can be all those things. And we also all have other parts of ourselves, no matter what, just normal human beings that are more, they're more private and they're not as obvious to other people. We don't show those parts to other people. And that's really common with humans. But then when we look kind of domestic violence, if indeed this is that, and I'm not saying that it is, but that lines up really well with how domestic violence offenders often conduct themselves. They are really one person in private, and that is what people see, and obviously something very different, kind of behind closed doors. So it's difficult for all of us, but for family and friends and other people to even consider that somebody that we know, we like, we've grown up with, whatever that is, might be capable of doing something really horrible. The financial piece of this obviously is it's a fraud conviction. So clearly he's demonstrated himself in being willing to take advantage of people, right? His being willing to defraud people and to perhaps obtain money or goods illegally. And that's just part of who we know that he is, because he was investigated and convicted of it. So, of course, there can be all kinds of other things that emerge around who he is as a person and what other people have maybe seen in terms of glimpses of his character. But it's pretty common to have an outside person and then something that may look very different in private.
And I'll call that other side there's the dark side, but the lighter side, I'll dub that the Instagram side. You look at Instagram, everyone's living a perfect life, seemingly perfect, but you don't know what lurks behind closed doors, and it appears in this case it wasn't anything, uh, you know, too kind. So moving on here, now the Boston Globe did some similar research and found that he's been described as a master manipulator and a seasoned schemer who left in his wake a long list of aggrieved former friends and business partners, including his own dentist and his own father, who died in 2018. And then he actually kept diary entries, and he bragged in these diary entries about the ease with which he could con those closest to him, writing, according to the Boston Globe, it's quote unquote easy for me to do them up. So again, it doesn't make you a killer, but he's talking about conning people, and he's very kind of lackadaisical about it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And that's kind of that. I mean, what we often see if there is a typical personality for someone that can be abusive in a relationship or something like that, whether it's physically or sexually, there is really a bit of narcissism on the part of the person that is alleged to be the offender, as well as a real lack of empathy. We see that pretty, whether that is something that is different really than being a sociopath. I mean, that would be a more, I think, extreme example of somebody that lacks empathy. But it's kind of in that vein of they seem to be able to do things that really cause pain, maybe even physical pain or violence to other folks, and perhaps feel bad about it for a little while, but then that story, or not, some never really do feel bad about causing harm to other people. But then that pattern, especially in intimate partner relationships, tends to recreate itself. There might be a period of time where things are better and there's hope again, and the person that you fell in love with looks again like the person that you actually fell in love with, and there are promises made and that kind of thing. And sadly, in a lot of these scenarios, the cycle just kind of begins again, and it repeats itself. A lot of people that abuse their partners love the power and the control that comes from that, and it can take a lot of different forms. But that's what it often is very much about. And so, if indeed they are able to get their way and control finances and control the social life and control the kids, control kind of just so many things, that whether or not they are able to kind of pursue their own spiritual path, whether or not they can pursue an education, like it can look like a lot of different things. But if a person has groomed, if you will, someone into that kind of life, they are pretty used to getting what they want and to pushing that envelope, and very reluctant to give up what they believe in their minds they own or have acquired. So a lot of times what we see, and again, this is just general education around domestic violence, but often what happens is, if there is either a threat to leave the abuser, or some action taken toward leaving, some big statement of independence such as that increases the risk for lethality to that victim by about 75%. I mean, that is a game changer a lot of the time. And when we look at, we look sometimes at homicides, domestic violence homicides post-mortem, if you will. We have fatality review boards all around the country. And the whole purpose of those is to try to look, sadly, after somebody's been killed, to see, well, what did we miss? Who knew what? And were there cries for help that we just didn't understand? were there things that we could have done that would have allowed them to access services or call the police and trust that process, or, and you learn a lot, sadly. What we've learned about people that are really dangerous, people that are high risk for lethality or potential for lethality, are from these post-mortem reviews on fatality review boards. And what we do know is that independence, that I'm leaving, that kind of sentiment can be very much something that offenders can't handle and may lash out against.
So, putting your attorney hat on for a minute, there's a mountain of evidence that's growing that is unfavorable toward Brian Walshe. Among what we're learning is that at a search of a transfer station, they found trash bags with blood, a hatchet, a hacksaw, rug, used cleaning supplies. We found out he spent $450 at a Home Depot buying cleaning supplies. No one that I've ever met has spent that kind of money. There was blood found in the basement of their rented home, as well as a knife. It's a pretty big hole from an evidence standpoint right now for him to climb out of. But when you look at it through your attorney lens, what do you see?
The police, I'm sure, are very busy gathering all necessary to complete a picture, or to at least, look at where the evidence directs them. And none of that is good from, Brian's perspective. And of course, he is presumed innocent, and that's a really important thing. But as you look and see that she's been missing for 9 days, there is physical evidence, not just in the house, although I'm sure they are rapidly working on the DNA and looking for whether that is her blood or not, probably pursuing maybe even the kids, or something to try to get another matching source of DNA to narrow that down. But you've got that evidence. A bloody knife in someone's basement is not necessarily something that is usual. You have the other things that they have found that have been discarded that look like they may have come from an area where he was and might have tried to discard them. They've got him, it sounds like, on video at the Home Depot, and assuming that is a positive identification, that's strong evidence of culpability. All of those things at some point create a picture that will perhaps, who knows, the police are working on getting to at least a probable cause standard so that they can put the information that they do have into an affidavit and a warrant and maybe make an arrest of someone if indeed all of those things are related to Mrs. Walshe. Now we don't know where she is, and I hope she is still alive and that this is all explainable in some other way, but it is really lining up to look like so many of the other cases that we hear about and see about. Sadly, this kind of femicide against spouses is not at all uncommon in this country and a lot of other places. So we have experience, I would say, in hearing about cases like this. And thank goodness law enforcement works as hard as they do and are as diligent as they are to try to really make sure they have good, reliable evidence before they make decisions. And perhaps that's what's going on.
And if she is no longer with us, which none of us hope is the case, would you expect murder charges sooner than later?
I think that's a difficult question, only because I'm not, all I know is what I've seen in the press, and having worked many cases and seen what I know as a prosecutor is going on versus what sometimes the press is saying about what is going on. And those two things can be very different. what I know is that there are probably some ends that they would really need to tie up. Not necessarily finding her. I mean, there are prosecutions without being able to actually find the body, if indeed, under your assumption, she's not with us. But I'm sure that they would want to have, especially in light of the fact that she has not been found, either dead or alive. I'm sure that they are really making sure that what they have is good and solid. But certainly that's the direction of what appears to be the evidence. That is certainly the direction that things are heading.
And you sent me some interesting talking points, which let's run through a few of them, and then we'll take some viewer comments, and then I'm going to let you get to your pickleball match, which I want to learn pickleball myself. One of the things here is the letter from his wife in the criminal fraud case that included language that Brian was working consistently on breaking the past habits of his family. And you couple that with what a source is telling me tonight, that they're learning from multiple law enforcement sources, among other things, that he was abusing at least one of the children. And what do you read into this verbiage here?
When you work domestic violence cases for a long time, which of course I did, and I still do a lot of education about, there are just certain things that kind of pop out at you. And in this particular case, as I described a little bit earlier, if this is a domestic violence relationship, what we know is that victims stay in those relationships often for some very, very good reasons. And one of the strongest reasons is that they are hopeful. They have kind of a lot of hope that a person will change, because who they fell in love with was not a monster. Who they fell in love with was somebody very different. And so when you hear that, what she wrote in the letter around, that he's really working hard to change this family pattern, or this, I forget exactly what the verbiage was, my alarm bells went off that, okay, there have been some ways that he interacts with the family that aren't okay, and that he has come to her and said, I'll change, I'll do this differently. So that, and then with the information about perhaps allegedly that he may have abused a child, often you will see both of those within a domestic violence home. Sometimes, and again, please, audience, this is all speculation, or really what it is just an opinion that's taken from a lot of experience. And of course, we don't know the facts of this case, but if indeed, sometimes domestic violence victims who will justify in some ways or make excuses for violence against them, sometimes when that violence turns toward a child, that is sometimes the straw that has them go, no, not my kids. And so other times, sadly, people stay in those relationships, or I shouldn't, they're not able to leave is really the best way to say it. And I've talked with enough survivors to understand it's not as simple as our Monday morning quarterback is for them. But, those two pieces just fit. They just fit a kind of a common domestic violence dynamic.
You always hear people say, well, why don't they just get a divorce? It's not really as simple as that. Why?
It is not as simple as that. First of all, the person in a domestic violence relationship that knows the most about what their risks are is the person that's experiencing the violence. And so we can look on the outside and go, well, just leave. Why don't you just leave? Get a divorce, or just leave him, or it's usually him, but not always. What we don't know is what the barriers are for those victims, and whether it's even remotely possible for them to be able to survive financially, whether they have a place to go, whether they have a job, whether they can sustain themselves. We know that on the money that they typically might get from the state, from government-run programs, and especially these days in a lot of parts of the country, that's just not a survivable scenario. The shelters are full. Domestic violence shelters simply have to turn people away right and left. And so, no, it's really not as simple. And then in addition to that, depending on what the dynamics are, they may really perceive and understand that they are in much more danger if they leave. They may know, perhaps there have been threats. If you leave me, this is what will happen. Don't ever leave me, et cetera, et cetera. They know what a person is probably capable of. And so again, it's easier for us just in a community to do that Monday morning quarterbacking. And I think partly that's because we feel safe and we want to believe that life is predictable and you can just fix situations. But I can just say that, these survivors are the strongest people I've ever met. And I've learned to just really respect how difficult it is for them sometimes to get a divorce or leave.
2 more talking points, and then we'll take a couple of comments and we'll call it a day. But next one you mentioned here is how evidence often lies out of sight until the right questions are asked of the right people. Can you explain that?
We always hope that we never get to a point where a person is murdered in domestic violence cases. We always pray and hope that that's what we're all aiming for, is to eradicate this from our culture. Typically, there are things that lead up to such a violent act. And sometimes victims call the police and sometimes they don't. But even if they don't call the police, often they're telling a loved one, a friend, a mother, a sister, a brother, what is happening. And they're hoping, because people need to talk about this stuff sometimes. And so often they extract a promise. You can't tell anybody, you can't call the police, you can't say anything. I just need to know you're on my side. So these are generally called outcry witnesses. And often along the course of a relationship, these victims will make outcry to different people. And so a lot of that evidence that will help us understand the context of a domestic violence case or relationship, we just don't know about it. And unless we go find it and ask about it, it's probably going to remain in the dark, right? And so things like, have they complained to the police before? Have they talked about or gotten help in trying to maybe get a protection order, or even talked about getting a protection order? Have they changed their routines so that they are staying safer? Maybe they've cut out friends from their life. They've done all of these things to try to appease the situation. And there are people that often know about those kinds of things. Have they tried to leave before unsuccessfully? So that kind of evidence, typically until we start to ask, and that's true for obviously living victims too. That's the point, is that we want to do better with cases with victims who are being abused and somehow have the courage to come forward. Get all of that evidence, not just the obvious stuff, so that we have a better. Does that answer your question?
It sure does. And then I guess perhaps one of the most heartbreaking pieces of this is something that Fox News reported, that the phone call to her mother 1 week before her disappearance, she pleaded with her mom to come to the United States. Does that indicate to you that problems had reached sort of an apex or a crescendo?
That is certainly something that, if that is not in character, or something that is routine, or something, that does stand out to me as a cry for some kind of help. Sadly, I don't know what was behind that. Kind of, none of us do. But certainly that's a lot to ask of your mom, who lives, thousands and thousands of miles away. It might be that she didn't have a big community here, having immigrated here in her adult years, maybe a young adult. But, that is one thing that I think is a barrier for immigrant community. They may not have the depth of relationships with other people that they can rely on for assistance or help. And so reaching out to her mom across the seas sounds like it was, she needed her mom, clearly needed some support and some help.
We all need our mothers. We'll switch over to some comments. We'll take a few of these and then we'll get your final thoughts. This one comes from B. Young. And they're talking here about when Brian Walshe entered court, he had this smile on his face. And this person writes that I'd never heard of this. That smile is called duper's delight. It's an inappropriate smile made by a manipulator or someone that thinks they are getting away with something. Are you familiar with that term?
I've not heard that term, no.
What did you, I don't know if you saw him entering court, but he had this like weird Joker-like smile on his face. What does that tell you about his character again?
It just, at a minimum, it just seems so incongruent with someone whose wife is missing and had been missing for a week or something at that point. I'm not sure how long, but that is the antithesis of the look you would expect to see from a concerned, distraught spouse who was worried only about the safety and return of their loved one. It does not look like what you would expect from somebody that was not involved somehow, or at least happy that she was gone.
This next comment comes from a woman named Deborah, and she writes, "This happened in my ex-husband's attempted murder case against me. He did 3 attempts. The third one resulted in him pushing me off the 8-story balcony of an Embassy Suites hotel back in 1989. He made a lot of mistakes, but he thought he was smarter than the cops or the FBI." I bring it up because a lot of women, I think, feel like and some men, but predominantly women, probably feel very alone, like they're the only ones. But you can see from Deborah's comment, this is a lot more prevalent than an average person might think. But how prevalent exactly is domestic violence, Anne?
Well, first of all, I'm so glad that she survived that fall and that relationship. That's just a terrible thing that she had to endure. And as she probably knows or may know and understand, this is really pretty common. Unfortunately, they estimate that about 50% of all marriages experience somewhere in there at least one episode of some kind of domestic violence. And that's a lot, for people to result to either some kind of crime or some kind of harm or some kind of assault or something that really crosses the line to the point where it would meet a definition of domestic violence. That's a really high number. What we know too is that not for all, right? Maybe somebody crosses the line once, maybe learns from it. But for folks that clearly believe that they're entitled to this person, they're entitled to their anger, they're entitled to everything that they want, this is something that sadly a lot of these survivors have to endure over and over. And again, I am always happy when someone can get out of a relationship like that and move on and find happiness. But I hold not much judgment for those that are still in, because I know how difficult it is for them to successfully leave. It typically takes about 7 attempts for a victim of domestic violence before they're actually able to leave. And of course, when you know them and you work with them or you have their cases or whatever it is, you understand that, and you have to keep your expectations low. You offer as much as you can to these survivors that are in these relationships, and you understand that they have to do this only if and when they're able.
Wow, 7 attempts. That's a lot. This next one comes from Smoji. Domestic abuse is always about power and control. It's not about doing what's practical or easy or normal. Divorce and paying alimony means a loss of control. In addition, many abusers feel entitled, also control, and would rather kill than pay a dime to their ex. Is Smoji right about this?
I really agree with the sentiment that says that it is all about power and control. And in each relationship, that may look a little bit different, but when a person has that and has groomed another person to be able to control them and control everything about their lives, the finances, etc., they are not interested in having to change that, especially to their own detriment. So if that means sometimes supporting the kids or sometimes supporting the ex-partner, that doesn't fit with their view of themselves or what they deserve. And so you see a lot of reluctance by domestic abusers to participate fully and responsibly in the lives of their kids or their spouse, if indeed it's an alimony situation.
And a final comment, because a lot of people basically, when they read this, said they were incredulous that Brian Walshe could be this stupid. But the comment is, my question is, does the internet actually have information on how to get rid of a body? This is disturbing enough without even looking at how it plays into the story. And as we know by now, he did a search for how to dispose of a 115-pound woman's body. And you and I were talking about how, because we're having some issues with technical stuff, how we love and hate technology. It is a problem that in this day and age, you can literally Google anything, even some of the most macabre, unimaginable things. And in that regard, he could get information, and there's really nothing that can be done about it because it doesn't appear there's enough regulation. Have you ever broached that subject or asked people if the internet could be a little bit more regulated so people who are stalkers or domestic violent abusers don't have such access to this kind of information?
It is something that we all watched kind of unfold that was going to increase the risk to especially domestic violence or stalking victims, because technology can so easily be used against them and to survey them and to manipulate them, to terrorize them, etc. Unfortunately, a lot of those methods are out there. And if used for legitimate purposes, they're not really a problem. If you have a grade school kid and you want to track where they are all the time, that's probably a proper use of a GPS tracking system on their phone. But of course, the flip side of that, and that is the story of the internet, is that for the benefits that we get from it, there are some horrible dark sides to it. And at least, even on platforms like Facebook, etc., we've seen the reluctance to kind of control the information, control the access, and that kind of thing. So it has got a very dark side, and my experience of late has honestly been that it has just found a way to grow and not shrink, and that is something that a lot of people work hard to try to combat and deal with, but it's so accessible, and it really can cause big problems for victims.
And the astute woman you've been listening to is Anne Munch. She's one of the preeminent experts in the fields of sexual assault and domestic violence. She began her legal career in the courtroom and also in the classroom. She has lent her expertise to the Department of Justice and has provided education and assistance numerous times to the United States Senate on issues related to sexual assault. I think the best way to end this tonight, Anne, is if you have some advice to women who find themselves in a uncompromising, uncomfortable, potentially deadly domestic violence situation, what is it that you would say directly to them?
What I would say is, first of all, you're not alone. Second of all, there is help available. There's a 1-800-SAFE, SAFE, is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And that hotline connects you to local advocacy groups near where you are. We have advocates all over the country, and really they're just there to listen and to help and to connect survivors with the help that they desperately need. So I know that there are far too many survivors out there, including some men. I've certainly met male survivors as well. I guess my advice is that my heart goes out. It's why I do this work, and that there are a lot of really good people in the world. And I'm sorry that you, unfortunately, are hooked up with maybe one of the others, not so respectful. But there is a help available if you're able to start looking at what some of those options are. We want you safe. We want you happy, and we want you being a productive member of society the way that your heart probably has always desired.
And again, while the evidence mounting against Brian Walshe does not look great in terms of Ana Walshe and her current situation, let us obviously think about her and hope that this does not have the ending many of us might be thinking could be coming. And also, let's keep her 3 young children, ages 2, 4, and 6, in our thoughts. And of course, we'll be back with another episode of Surviving the Survivor. Love you, America.